Hi everyone, my name is Iben and welcome to another episode of the Road to Planet Zoo 2. Today we're going to talk about the big one, flying birds. We're going to talk about what makes flying difficult in these games, how Frontier has tackled that in their other games, and what implications that might have on Planet Zoo 2 if they decide to introduce flying birds into the game. In this first part of the video, I want to talk about the difficulty of flying. I want to talk about which elements of that system make it so difficult to introduce it to a game like Planet Zoo. To understand the complexity of a flying system, we need to compare it to something that we know, and flying is a lot like the deep diving system in this game. Both deep diving and free flying are a form of 3D navigation in an enclosed space. They, unlike habitat animals, need to be able to move from left to right, from backwards to forwards, and from up to down, whilst habitat animals basically only have to move to left, right, forward and backwards, and of course sometimes climb trees, but that's a whole different thing. The major difference between these two systems, however, is that deep diving only really has to care about very simple barriers. Let me show that in a diagram. As you can see, when it comes to barriers, the top barrier for deep diving is very simple. It is just one single horizontal line and it can't do anything more than that. That makes it a lot easier. But however, when we look at something like free flying, the top barrier is completely different. Here I'm showing a very simple form of an aviary, but we all know that these can get really complex. Because some zoos have aviaries like this, and these are relatively simple. But then things get even more complex. You introduce some poles, the netting is at a different angle, there's all kinds of weird shapes. But they can go all the way up to these incredible complex monstrosities of an aviary. It has so many different shapes, angles. It is super complex, much more complex than the water is in which an animal has to deep dive. On top of that, the enclosed space is entirely defined by the player. They get to decide the angles, they get to decide how high it is, they get to decide how complex it is. That makes it a lot more complex than, for instance, deep diving again, because at the end of the day, there the barriers are much simpler. You've got a very simple top barrier and very straightforward barriers on the left, right and bottom. But this isn't the first time that Frontier has tackled free flying. These are the pigeons from Planet Coaster 1, they've been reintroduced in Planet Coaster 2, and they were the first time that Frontier introduced some kind of free flying. It is relatively simple, it is not as complex as their other games, but it's not the first time that they tackled this issue. Let's take a look at the other game in which they tackled free flying. After taking their first steps in Planet Coaster, they took this to a whole new level in the Jurassic World Evolution series. Starting off at the very end of Jurassic World Evolution 1, this Pteranodon exhibit was introduced. And I'm saying exhibit for a very good reason, because this is exactly like we had in Planet Zoo. This is one big exhibit with looped animations. The pterodons in here are not free flying, they are simply performing a set of looped animations. But all of that changed in Jurassic World Evolution 2. In this game they took the flying pterosaurs and decided to set them free, and they are now capable of moving around freely like any other animal in the game. Of course, whilst we want free flying, we don't want these animals flying free in our parks. That's why Frontier introduced the aviary system that is slightly customizable, allowing people to just create their own shapes. And this is the big thing about Jurassic World Evolution. The aviary system is a auto-generated one. That means that you aren't building the aviaries piece by piece, but instead you build the aviaries using an aviary tool, and the tool will generate the aviary for you. Let's take a look at what that looks like in-game. I'm currently in Jurassic World Evolution 2 for a reason I'll explain later, but the aviary system in Jurassic World Evolution 2 and Jurassic World Evolution 3, the most recent game, are pretty much the same. What you start with is this basic aviary shape, and this is the smallest an aviary can get in this game. If you place it down, this is the shape of your aviary, this is as small as it can get, it doesn't get bigger, and you can't really change anything about it once it's placed down. You can't make it higher, you can't change it to, for instance, glass. It is what it is right now. But as you might have seen, there's a whole bunch of dotted lines when I'm placing these aviary pieces, and that's because once you get a little bit of overlap, the shape is adjustable. You can essentially add multiple aviaries and the game will automatically merge them together for you. Another important thing that you should know about the aviaries in Jurassic World Evolution, there's only really one shape and there's a few variations on the actual material used. Here we have a glass dome, here we have a mesh dome, and that's because it's all part of the canon. The Jurassic World and Jurassic Park series basically only had aviaries that looked like this, so there was not really an incentive for Frontier to really make a very complex aviary system like we see in zoos, because essentially all they had to do was create a system that was able to recreate what was in the movies. I mentioned earlier that I'm in Jurassic World Evolution 2 and not in Jurassic World Evolution 3, and the reason for that is this little critter, it's Jehalopterus. Jehalopterus is the smallest possible flying animal in the series, and the reason why I wanted to show this one is because it gives us a good idea how this aviary system works for smaller animals. One thing that I do have to mention, in Jurassic World Evolution 2 they can only perch on the ground, they cannot walk on the terrain on the ground. This is something that they've added in Jurassic World Evolution 3, so this isn't the end all thing here. This is a system that they've already approved on in the next game. So if you were worried about smaller animals in the Jurassic World Evolution aviary system, I hope this takes away your worries. As you can see, it's a very small animal, but it seems to work just fine. It doesn't lag or do anything weird. So yeah, small animals certainly work inside of this aviary system, and I couldn't see why even slightly smaller animals like the Jehalopterus wouldn't work in this system. Now that we've seen how they achieved free flying in Jurassic World Evolution, we might want to take a look at what the implication is for a potential aviary system in Planet Zoo 2. This is going to be a bold statement, but with free flying being achieved in Jurassic World Evolution, I think exhibit boxes are a thing of the past, at least for flying animals. Looking at how they did it in Jurassic World Evolution, I think there are many possible solutions to introduce a free flying system to Planet Zoo 2. The first system that I want to look at is a system very similar to Jurassic World Evolution. In a system that is similar to Jurassic World Evolution, I can imagine us getting a bunch of aviary shapes like I have here in my blueprint tab, and that you basically start by grabbing an aviary that is the closest to the shape you want. And for instance, let me start with this one. And I'll just place it down, and then you take another one, and the moment you get close to it, it merges into one single aviary. I would imagine that we would get a little bit more customization than in Jurassic World Evolution, and a good comparison would be the path tool. Basically, you can just make the initial shape wider and smaller by simply dragging the width and maybe making it longer in the way that you do with the length. In the same vein, I think you will probably be able to edit some of the functions here. For instance, the height of this pole in the middle or the curvature of this cable here. And to just give you an idea how that might work, we can actually just grab the fence tool because it already has a lot of these options. So I would imagine that you would be able to raise and lower each individual post like this, probably move it around as well to adjust the shape. And just like you have with the fence, you would be able to turn it into a curved top, and you would be able to just change the starting angle. I know that Jurassic World Evolution doesn't have that kind of customization, but as I mentioned in the other part of the video, There was no real incentive to do that. Jurassic World Evolution 2 introduced the aviaries, and that was before they added so many customization options. And in all honesty, the aviary system in Jurassic World Evolution already really does a pretty good job at trying to recreate the aviaries that are canon in the Jurassic World and Jurassic Park series. The second system that I want to look at is a system more similar to how we build habitats in Planet Zoo. Another way I could see it working is pretty similar to the previous system, so all of the customization would be the same, but instead of having a predefined shape, you would basically just create a habitat like you used to, and once you connect this up with each other, you'll get a auto-generated roof like this. I didn't do a great job at connecting everything, but it gets the point across. Again, with the same kind of interaction as you can do with the fencing right now, I would imagine that if you pulled this up, the cable here would be attached and you would get a different curve. All of that would be relatively easily to adjust. I think that is a possible solution. Again, very much the same core principle of Jurassic World Evolution with an auto-generated aviary, but instead with a lot more customization, and that has been the case for almost everything in Planet Zoo. Every feature that Planet Zoo and Jurassic World Evolution seem to share, Planet Zoo always has a more complex and more customizable version of the tool that is in Jurassic World Evolution, so I don't really see a reason why we can't expect an aviary system that is similar to the one in Jurassic World Evolution wouldn't get some improvements and more customization in Planet Zoo. Given that free flying is an option and probably is the one they are going to go for, I think we are looking at the end of the walkthrough exhibit. One question that I see pop up in forums and in Discords quite often is, what about smaller birds? Wouldn't they be in walkthrough exhibits? And I understand that question because the majority of the free-flying animals in Jurassic World Evolution are bigger animals, so I understand that initial reaction. However, as a developer myself, I do think it is not impossible that Frontier introduces two systems, but I do think it's going to be unlikely. The major reason for that is that the distinction is not intuitive. And let me explain that to you. When you think about it, has the game ever told you why these three kind of animals were in an exhibit box? The game never really explicitly does so. And still you intuitively understand why these animals are inside of the exhibit system instead of the habitat system. It makes sense. When you go to a zoo, you see these animals inside the kind of terrariums that exhibit boxes represent. And that's because almost all core game systems on Planet Zoo are very intuitive. It's woven all throughout the game. For instance, a climbing animal like a chimpanzee, if you want it to climb, you need to give it something to climb in. Makes sense. An animal like a seal will want to swim, so you'll have to give it something to swim in. You'll have to give it a pool of water. A kangaroo, for instance, can escape their habitat if the barrier is too low. You know this because kangaroos are known for being able to jump very high and very far. The game doesn't really have to tell you all of these things, because all of these things are things that you already know. You know these facts from real life, and it helps you process the game. This decreases the learning curve for players. There are many systems that you need to get the hang of in Planet Zoo, so the more systems that are very intuitive and are based on knowledge that the people already have, the less brainpower needs to be spent on those systems, and the more brainpower can be spent on more complex systems that might need a little bit more assistance. And just to give you an idea how far these things go in software development, I was once part of a meeting where we talked about the placement of a certain button for about 30 minutes, just to make sure that it was very intuitive and it wasn't going to confuse users. This is something that Frontier really has to take into account as well, and that's why so many of their systems are so intuitive. And that brings me to, what about smaller birds and exhibit boxes? The problem is the distinction isn't intuitive. If I show you these three animals, can you tell me which ones would be in a free-flying aviary system and which one would be inside of an exhibit box? Just from looking at these animals, It's hard to tell, and that's a big problem. The problem is that there is no clear distinction between aviaries and zoos like there is a distinction between terrariums and habitats. We instinctively know the difference between a habitat and an exhibit box because a terrarium is completely different from an open savanna exhibit. But small aviaries and big aviaries, that's a more difficult distinction because yes, you've seen macaws in a small aviary, but you've also seen them in a big aviary. The distinction is really difficult to make, and that makes it really hard for people to understand which birds would have to be in which system. And I just want to showcase this post on Reddit from a few days ago because it perfectly illustrates the point. This is a valid question. The person here was trying to put the sloth inside of a habitat, and that's kind of logical that they tried to do that. All of the climbing mammals that the game has so far, all of them were habitat animals. The fact that the sloth was the only exhibit one doesn't really make intuitive sense. You would assume that it would be a habitat animal. And of course, we as longtime Planet Zoo players, we understand why the sloth was in an exhibit and not in a habitat because we read it on the forums, we read it when they put out their interview, but not everyone does that, and then you get situations like this. This is only one animal, but imagine this with a whole bunch of birds, where people just don't really understand why a bird is in an exhibit box versus why the other bird is in this big aviary that they can customize themselves. And this makes it so much harder for Frontier as well. This gives them so many support requests and so many questions that they need to answer. So it wouldn't really make sense to have these two systems together because it just causes confusion, especially with animals that can't really have a clear distinction like the habitat and the exhibit box animals have. A suggestion that I've seen pop up quite a lot is what about some text or tutorial? And here is where my experience as a front-end developer comes in. This is something that we've noticed as a group over the last few years. People read less and less text and follow less and less tutorials. They want their software and they want their games to be very intuitive. They don't want to spend time reading, they just want to dive into it and get it right away. So a piece of text or a tutorial isn't a solution anymore. It used to be a solution like 5 or 6 years ago, but things have massively changed. And that is in part because we've made applications that are so intuitive. We made it possible for people to understand an application without a manual, and now everyone expects every application to work like that. So they don't want to spend time reading a manual, reading a text, or following a tutorial. Things just have to be intuitive right away. The question that then gets asked is, what about really small birds, like really small finches? And from my perspective, I think Frontier is going to focus on the more well-known birds like macaws, toucans, eagles, owls, doves, pigeons, stuff like that, over animals like finches and other smaller birds. I am afraid that Frontier probably isn't going to try to make a system that works for all these animals, or will try to introduce two different systems, especially if the smaller birds usually don't interest a lot of the general audience. That is a shame, but it's the reality that Frontier has to look into. They had the same with animals like mice, rats, hedgehogs. Those also didn't end up being in the exhibit boxes, even though they might have been suited for that. Probably there was a technical reason why they didn't work, and they might just have said, hey, these animals don't interest enough of people to really introduce a system that can handle them. And I think the same will be for very small birds, for birds like finches. I simply think that Frontier is going to focus on the bigger birds, and the smallest one will probably be the size of a lorikeet. As a way to end this video, I do have one theory that I want to talk about. Now, don't get me wrong, it does make sense that the Barnyard Pack introduces the petting mechanic, but it kind of felt weird that we would get such a big feature at what was essentially almost the end of Planet Zoo. It never really sat right with me. I didn't understand why this one pack got an update that introduces such a big feature, and then all the other packs after it simply do not introduce anything. Especially for those who think, just like me, that the Zookeeper's pack probably was the last pack and that the last 2 packs that we got were more of a reaction to Planet Coaster 2, but I digress. It just feels weird that only this pack really got this big feature so late in the game. So here's my little theory, my little conspiracy theory. I think that the petting mechanic might be backported from Planet Zoo 2. I think that they were already working on Planet Zoo 2, that they already had aviaries where guests would be able to interact with flying animals in the aviaries, like lorikeets, and feeding them. And for this update, they backported this functionality to Planet Zoo. It's a conspiracy theory, it's quite wild, I have no evidence for this, I just wanted to put this in this video because it's a nice way to end it. Let me know what you think about it. This might just me be grasping at straws, but honestly, a part of my brain thinks that this is the case. A part of my brain wants to believe that Frontier already has free-flying aviaries with guests that are able to interact with the birds inside of them. Let me know what you think about birds in Planet Zoo 2. Are you excited for them? Are you not excited for them? How do you think they will tackle them? Leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!